China's image issues means that you're going to have water bottles inside of your shoes.
Okay, so you're telling me that image issues in China are going to put water bottles that I drink from inside my shoes?
Yes, water bottles just like these will be inside of your shoes because of China's image issues. Let's get to it. Welcome to the knock-on effect. This is where we start with the thing you know and end up in a strange place. I'm Justine Underhill, and joining us today is our scrappy guesser, Alex Rosenberg.
Very good. How are you?
Very good. And we have, of course, our picture-perfect professor joining us from an undisclosed location, Roger Hurst.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, hello. And now the professor and I will not just take you on a journey from China's image issues to water bottles in your shoes. Okay. We're going to have actually a few pit stops along the way with 4 completely unique knock-on effects. So we're going to have almost a hub and spokes model of the knock-on effect this week.
Great.
So of course this week we begin in China, as we have for many other episodes, but this is a little,
like the China
little
show
bit
now.
different. China isn't known as one of the world's cleanest places.
No, that's not the stereotype.
Yeah, not what it's known for. Actually, quick fact here, China's air pollution is so extreme that in 2015, Berkeley Earth estimated that it contributed to 1.6 million deaths per year. So image issue there for sure.
Also death issue, right?
Death
and that's
issue,
not just an image issue, is it? It's like saying like Jack the Ripper had a bad PR firm. Like,
yeah,
okay.
It's like there are other issues there. No, so China actually has its own pollution issues, but they've also been importing a lot of the world's pollution. Okay, so Professor, can you tell us what's been going on here?
That's right. China has been the dumping ground for pretty much everybody in the world. They've accepted nearly 300 million metric tons of America's scrap alone over the last 25 years, so a quarter of a century. Paper, plastic, recycling, pretty much anything. But also Japan, countries in the European Union, and from all over the developing world, basically everyone and anyone has been sending all their waste products to China.
People don't realize that there is a huge global trash trade. Countries from all over the world, and this is primarily the direction, have been sending a lot of waste to China. Now, when we use the word waste, I want to be clear, that includes trash and recycling. I did speak with someone in an industry group, a recycling industry group. They got very upset that I was using the word waste, but they did say it's not the battle to pick because everybody uses the word waste for both trash and recycling.
What word did they like?
They liked scrap. So you'll see me use scrap interchangeably.
Scrap?
Scrap, because it is a lot of this.
So if I throw out my cat's litter box, you know, it's scrap?
Well, because a lot of what's getting sent to China are things that are being reused, because that's where the market is. And so they consider it scrap because it's not like it's getting discarded completely. This is a huge business. So 72% of the world's plastics end up in China. $2.2 billion of paper and plastic from the US ends up in China. Now, why it's such a big business, we will get to in a little bit. But first, we need to get to the news of the day, which is, guess what? This year, China said, no more. We don't want any more of your recyclables, your plastics, et cetera. And actually, it's a little bit more nuanced. Professor, what's been happening there?
They've instituted, why they've come up with this name, their national sword policy. Initially, this is banning about 24 materials, so post-consumer plastic, mixed paper, and various other stuff, cardboard, plastic, scrap metal. But they've also, and this is sort of the sneaky bit as well, they sort of say, look, yes, we'll still take some stuff, but it can only be 0.5% impure. And that means that small amounts of food scraps, bits and pieces that gets into this scrap can ruin a batch of recycling, and it's a threshold which is now far too low for most of the US current technology to handle. So it's really, they've banned pretty much all of it.
Yeah, so basically if you get a little bit of ketchup on your newspaper, or I don't know, there's a banana peel in some of the recycling, that can completely ruin the whole batch.
So you're saying when I recycle a bottle, so you throw some things together in a bag and then you put it somewhere. Is it processed in the US? and then the processed stuff is sent to China?
So we'll get to some of the actual, the lineage of like how it actually works. But yes, a lot of what we have in the US ends up going to China. China is bigger in terms of processing recyclables than the next 10 countries combined. So they are sort of the big whale in this, and the fact that they're closing their borders to a lot of these recyclables has been a huge problem, and it's all because of the fact that they're trying to appear more of environmentally friendly.
But the irony is...
You picked up on the irony. Yeah, no, keep going.
No, we think of it as environmentally friendly to recycle because we're not seeing the
effects of what's going on? It's a double-edged sword.
Is that why it's called the sword policy?
Maybe. So it's, in some ways, I mean, Adam Minter, who's a columnist at Bloomberg, he also wrote Junkyard Planet. He went to some of these recycling facilities and towns in China. They are literally wastelands. It is toxic, it is gross. There's Christmas tree lights get recycled, and sometimes what happens is they just get burned. And then you get the resulting copper wire that's left behind. And so it's sort of like all these chemicals are going into the environment. The recycling industry in China isn't all that clean in some sense.
I want to let you keep going, but the question that everyone will want to know is, are you better off just throwing the lights in the garbage then rather than recycling them?
This is something that we will
get
to that.
Right.
Yeah, so basically this is China's policy of Yang La Ji, which is a campaign against foreign waste. And this has actually been an issue for a long time. Now, China has banned materials coming into its country before. They banned e-waste, so electronic waste, in the 2000s, because there's a lot of like toxic chemicals and other things that are in a lot of this electronic waste.
Physical things.
So like,
I thought it was like junk emails. I was like, where do all these junk emails get sent?
No. This is like
physical.
Get sent
to one city in China.
Laptops, computers, cell phones, all those things, they get taken apart. But you know, there are things like mercury in them that gets into the water source. Children are oftentimes the ones that are disassembling these. And there's a movie that came out recently called Plastic China that sort of highlighted like all this awful stuff that's going on in this industry. But anyway, the important thing is to know what happened when they banned e-waste is, guess what? There became a huge black market for electronic waste because it is so darn valuable in China. And so actually right now in East Asia alone, it's estimated that the e-waste black market is worth $3.75 billion. And so using that as a model, our first knock-on effect of the day is that we are likely to see a recycling black market pop up in China. Because guess what? This is an industry that employs 1.5 million people, and it also supports another 10 million jobs. And this kind of gets into where we're going next, which is how big this industry is in China and why it became such a big industry. And for that story, we need to travel back in time to the 1980s. Professor, what was going on in the 1980s?
So during the 80s and the 90s, there weren't many options for raw materials. The government sort of were the source of resources and gave them to the sort of state monopolies. But there was a manufacturing boom going on, and they needed cheap and easy to access raw materials. And so rather than throwing technology at the problem, guess what China did? They threw millions of laborers at the problem.
Yeah, so basically what happened is China was going through a manufacturing boom. They needed raw materials. A lot of the businesses didn't have enough, so it was cheap enough to import raw materials, plastics and other things that were discarded by the West to them, and then they were basically able to turn that into new products. So that's sort of how this economy got formed, and it's believed that the recycling industry was actually one of the backbones of China's rise to being such a global power in terms of being able to create so many materials because they didn't have those raw materials on their own. And then on the other hand, places like the US, Canada, the UK had more waste that they knew what to deal with, and so it was sort of a beneficial trade to send a lot of their discarded materials to China.
So bottles will go to China, and people in China will make them into, back into plastic, and then that plastic will be used for other things, or back into metal, or back into... Exactly.
But guess what? China's no longer accepting that material, and they still need a lot of raw materials. So what are they going to do? We have Adam Minter, who I mentioned before, a reporter for Bloomberg. He went to a paper recycling conference in China, and a trade association candidly said that they're facing a shortfall of at least 5 million metric tons of raw material. So a lot of this material has to come from somewhere. They're not getting it from the recycling anymore. That leads us to our next knock-on effect. Knock-on effect number 2, China is buying more virgin plastics. So virgin is the new sorts of plastic.
Right.
China's actually turning to the petrochemical industry in the US, specifically Houston, amongst other places, to meet its plastic demand. So Professor, what's going on here?
Well, brand spanking new plastic is replacing all the recycled stuff. And it's great for some of the chemical companies, people like Dow DuPont, who are basically finding a new market for millions of tons of new production. And this is expected to quintuple certain types of production by 2020. So it's big. And you can see this in virgin polyethylene. Imports are now up 19%, while scrap of polyethylene imports has dropped by 11%. So this is big business, and US companies are at the vanguard.
Yeah, so the fact that China is no longer recycling as much, they're actually buying more plastics from the US, so kind of a new plastic specifically. It was expected there's going to be a lot more plastic facilities actually coming online in the US in the coming years, and so there was thoughts that there's going to be drops in new plastic prices, but it seems that that's actually not going to be the case because of all the insane demand that suddenly sprung up in China.
So, and I'll go back to this irony as I'm learning about it, but because China is trying to look more environmental, actually more plastic is just going to waste and more oil is just being converted into new plastic, which is probably not a super environmental process.
That's exactly right. So there is, that is sort of the other side of the sword here.
Or the shoe.
Or the shoe.
Which I'm waiting to get back
to. Next shoe to drop. Well, for the next economic impact that we have for our next knock-on effect, we do need a little bit of background. So the background is basically recycling companies, so that could be companies or local municipalities collect all the recycling, then they sell it, so they actually get a profit. They sell it to someone to go through it, sort it, melt it down, all that other stuff. And so that process, they're getting paid for selling off what's usable waste. Those prices are getting affected because municipalities, those companies aren't able to make as much money, and we'll get to that knock-on effect. But what's key here is that this system worked really well to actually send a lot of the waste to China because of our trade deficit. So if you think about it this way, boats coming from China with a lot of goods, and then they had to leave the US and go back to China, they'd oftentimes be empty.
We make stuff too.
Yeah,
garbage.
Garbage. Yeah, it's basically a lot of China's products coming back home. Is one way to put it. But if you think about it, it's pretty interesting economics because a ship going one way isn't the same price as a ship going the other way because it has to return back. And so they oftentimes gave a discount to US, anyone that wanted to put something on in the US and send it back to China, and waste was so cheap. Just throw it on the boat. And so shippers are going to be affected. So now because of this ban, we're going to see more empty ships returning to China. And the other thing is that it's going to cost more to actually get rid of our recycling because it's now going to places like Malaysia and India, and there aren't as many boats that want to go there. And so the shipping costs are actually going to be a lot more.
Could be good for those countries as they produce things. They might be able to more easily get it shipped back to the US.
Yes, exactly. And so there are some arguments that this is going to boost their manufacturing industry, but we do have a lot of these countries actually overwhelmed with recycling. So all the other countries have been sending to Thailand, Malaysia, India, have been sending their recycling, and now they're closing their doors to some of this recycling because it's actually overwhelming. So it's sort of shutting down business even in other countries. Now, for the next knock-on effect, we want to focus on recycling companies, some of the recycling companies and the process that we were just talking about. Professor, can you tell us about what's going on with recycling companies in the United States?
It's problems with profits and profit projections. I think it's the two biggest solid waste service companies are Waste Management and Republic Services, and both of them recently downgraded their profit forecasts in the recycling divisions, which is obviously quite a big part of their business. In fact, Republic now loses money on most of the recycled scrap it now sells overseas. So the sources of cash revenue have started to dry up.
Yeah, so I actually have a quote here from Richard Coupland, who's at Republic Services. He said, quote, "At this point in time, we have zero volume going to China. We are still able to move material, but our economic model is completely upside down."
Wow.
And so this has been affecting a lot of different companies, but also municipalities. Costs are increasing. They're getting passed along to U.S. consumers and households. In some places, parts of Idaho, Maine, Pennsylvania, waste managers are continuing to recycle, but they're looking into regulations and laws where they could actually increase the price potentially on some of the households and businesses. Other places, what they've been doing is they've just been stockpiling recycling because they didn't want to. They don't have any place for it to go, but they don't want to like let it go for free, or they don't know what to do with it, so they're just holding on to it. In California, officials are actually concerned that improperly stored bales of paper could become hazards during wildfire season. And then the final way to deal with this is, of course, just to take it straight to a landfill. Oregon's one of their disposal companies sent, quote, all its recycling to landfills for the first few months of the year. So yeah, basically what we were talking about, we have more plastics.
I would expect that out of
Oregon. I know, it's become very controversial because they do like to recycle quite a bit. But so basically you have a lot more plastics getting burned. You have China needing to get more plastics in, so you kind of have a very fragile economy, a very fragile cycle that kind of got broken when China stepped out.
So I'm going to ask some follow-up questions here.
Yeah.
You know, if you throw this in the thing at the next to the grocery store, you'll usually get like 5 cents or 10 cents.
Yeah.
Are you going to lose those?
So that's what I asked this woman who works at this recycling industry group, ISRI, and she basically said, I asked her if the 5 cents return was going to go away. She said, we haven't gotten there yet. So it could be coming. That could be something that might get changed. But that's, you know, it's only been since January this has been going on. We still have yet to see the full-fledged effects of everything.
So now get back to my other question about the Christmas lights, because if it was on the margins anyway, in terms of, you know, recycling leads to some good things, some bad things, and on the whole, maybe it was good. Now that we're in sort of a different regime, is it really still, I mean, I don't even know how you judge environmentally good since it's kind of qualitative and...
It depends on how you recycle. Okay. So first of all, recycling can take a lot of energy to separate it, to process it, to melt it down.
And there are all those fights you get in about, do you keep the cap on or not?
Yeah,
you know?
right. And a lot of people recycle improperly. So there's all sorts of, and that can mess up a lot of things. And then it depends on how you recycle it. So sometimes the recycling in China is a really dirty business. It doesn't have to be that way, but for cost-effective reasons, burning things and then getting the copper wire or whatever it is that's left over, even though it's something useful, is very dirty. But there are other, let's say for Christmas lights, there's this really ingenious solution where they ground it down into like tiny bits, put it on water, the copper separates from the plastic, and then it kind of, you get these two streams of runoff.
Kids, this is a fun thing to do at home when Christmas is over. All January, you can separate materials.
Yeah, exactly. So there are different ways to go about doing it. It all depends on how you actually do it, whether it's a really dirty, labor-intensive, energy-intensive business or not.
Right, and this, I have to ask one more granular, no pun intended, question, which is the obvious solution would seem to be a technological one that, you know, China or Malaysia or India would come up with the technologies that use all this stuff and do it in a cleaner way so you don't get the horrible pollution.
Right. But the whole reason that this grew into such a big industry was because China threw so many laborers at it. Labor was cheap in China, and it was just easier to have humans sort through it and figure it out. Right now, labor isn't as cheap in China, so you do have the recycling industries moving, even without this regulations that are going on in China, moving away from China because it's just not as cheap as it used to be. So you kind of have this whole ecosystem that's falling apart. And then, of course, we have our final knock-on effect. Yeah, okay. So let's recap a little bit.
Yeah.
So we have China no longer buying the world's scrap materials.
Sorry.
Just like that, you wanted to play with something.
I was recapping.
Oh, okay. Oh, ha, ha, ha.
Sorry.
And that means that there's a glut of recycled materials looking for a home. Okay. So prices of recycled plastic have plummeted because you have all the stuff that's not being used. I mean, the biggest buyer is no longer there. So it's become a lot cheaper for companies that use recycled plastics to be able to collect these materials. Now I want to back up a little bit. So 1 million plastic bottles are sold every minute in the world, which is quite a lot. Yeah. So do you know what these get turned into?
No.
So they get turned into pellets.
I like that it was the most boring answer possible, and you said it with such
pellets. Yeah, it's
vim.
Well, basically what happens is recycled bottles get downcycled. They don't often get turned back into plastic water bottles because it's a little bit cloudy, the plastic. They have to get turned into something that's a little bit of a lesser quality. So they get downcycled into things like lawn chairs. Carpeting actually has a lot of plastic water bottles in it. Bags, packaging, synthetic fibers for clothing. That's become in big demand because of the athleisure trend. And then
all those things that are wicking away. It's just you drink the water, you work out, you sweat, you drink the water, you work out. It's like all a cycle.
Big cycle all in your body. And then, of course, these get downcycled into shoes. So it's no surprise right now that because plastics have become so much cheaper, specifically recycled plastics, Adidas came out last month and said that it's committed to using only recycled plastics in all of its products by 2024. So, Professor, what are some of the numbers here?
Adidas, they launched their first mass-produced running shoe with recycled water bottles in 2016, and they're targeting 5 million of sales this year. And they hope to raise this to 11 million sales by 2019.
Now, Adidas isn't the only brand doing this. Oh,
I'm just saying it doesn't say.
Not your shoe.
But it looks recycled, doesn't it?
It does look recycled.
Kind of recycled look, right?
Yeah, it does look recycled. I mean, so maybe Nike will hop on the bandwagon here too.
Excuse me, that's New Balance.
Oh, it has an N, you're right. That's true. Okay, ew, put your shoe back on, or not. So clothing brands like Patagonia, H&M, they already use a lot of recycled polyester in some of their materials. And now that the price of these recycled plastics is so much cheaper and is going to get so much cheaper, I wouldn't be surprised if you see a lot more companies coming out and saying, hey, we're going to start using a lot of these plastic pellets, specifically from water bottles, in our clothing, in our shoes, especially following Adidas' lead. Companies, when I was talking to the woman who worked at ISRI, she said that a lot of companies do this for social responsibility reasons, but then I said, but are they really doing it for social responsibility reasons? Or are they doing it because it's cheaper to use some of this recycled plastic? And she said it's definitely a little bit of both. But in their reports, they're not going to say, oh, we did it because it's cheaper. They're going to say we did it because it's friendly or socially responsible.
Right.
So yeah, based on that, you're going to start to see more plastic water bottles in your shoes, definitely in the future as these prices come down.
Now, how much will the price of oil affect this whole ecosystem?
Oh, very much. So oil affects the virgin plastic industry. And so actually new plastics very highly track that dimension. But now you're going to have a lot of more demand from China coming online for those plastics, so that's definitely pushing up the price. And the US is actually investing heavily in having more recycling plants here where we actually break down the materials. So basically taking what China used to be and bringing it home. So yeah, it could be a whole new world, especially in Wisconsin. Wisconsin's gonna be bringing on a bunch of new factories very soon.
We always end in some random state. You ever notice that? It's like Wisconsin.
Oregon, Wisconsin.
Wisconsin with the sand too.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll use the sand. Maybe it'll be the same. It'll be there's like a Taco Bell Pizza Hut. Could be like a sand
and recycling
factory.
We'll see about that.
That's
Anyways,
where I want to work.
Do you have any takeaways from all of this?
Oh my goodness. You know what? It's fascinating how, and this is what's really fascinating about China, that they're so powerful, they're so in the middle of everything, as the U.S. is, but since the U.S. is more, I think I'm allowed to say this, more democratic, more capitalistic than China is, like the 10-cent bottle deposit, that's going to be there for centuries, just like we're still making pennies because there's so many stakeholders and so many people have to weigh in. And there's not one person who can snap their fingers and say, you know what, enough with all these plastics. Because it's up to the individual companies to an extent it's not in China. It's really interesting that China is so powerful and they're so centrally managed still that small decisions just ripple across the world in ways that even the U.S. president, who probably is more powerful than Xi Jinping in a technical sense, I mean, could blow up the world faster, that's for sure, but that the U.S. president couldn't affect the global supply chain as quickly or easily.
Right, and that's because basically China, and we've seen this in a bunch of other knock-on effects, has built itself up as controlling and having almost monopolies on certain fields. So whether it be certain materials or certain things like wine and having such a big influence there. Yeah. We see them basically controlling a lot of different aspects.
Oh, you just turned water into wine.
Yes. Oh, there you go. Professor, do you have any takeaways?
It's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I'm just listening to the whole kind of the fact that everybody used China as its dumping ground and then complained about China being a dumping ground. and now, it's going into reverse, but then it means that the recycling is actually now potentially becoming more efficient and actually proper recycling. I mean, it's fascinating, and it kind of feels like it's going in a better direction now.
Yeah, actually. So while people were saying like, oh, this is actually not very environmentally friendly, I do think that this is actually pushing us or forcing us to go in a better direction overall.
Hope so.
Yeah. All right. Well, that does it for this week's knock-on
Nicely done,
effects.
Justine.
Thank you. Yeah. All our different knock-on effects, all the different areas that get impacted from shipping to DuPont to the plastics industry, all these wonderful things. Thank you guys so much.